today I'm going to, of course, be talking about World War One. I'll get to that subject, of course, the part two lecture where mostly I'm going to talk about like good chunk of it's going to be, of course, about the Russian Revolution, the aftermath of that that leads to the Soviet Union forming, of course, in Russia. So we'll get to that today. Also talk about how the United States also entered the war in 1917. We'll get to the end of the war, how the Germans lose pretty much World War One. And then you have the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, of course, that comes on the heels of the end of the war. So I'm going to, of course, first talk about, like I said, the Russian Revolution, which I'll kind of get into some of the causes of it and the effects of it and how the revolution breaks out and all that. In Russia, they had this revolution that broke out, like a second one, really had one in 1905, they had before. But in 1917, this caused the Russian Empire to collapse. Basically where Nicholas II was pretty much forced into abdication at that point. Later, also by March of 1918, the Russians would even withdraw from the war. They signed a separate treaty with the Germans, so-called Brest-Litovsk Treaty in March of 1918. So they basically end up getting out of the war. And then later on after that, you have a Russian civil war, between like those are the communists and non-communists in the country. And then you then have the formation of course, the Soviet Union, which we'll get to later about that. But the Russian Revolution had a lot of causes. I mean, you could go through all kinds of causes I've got here. Obviously, a lot of lack of reforms, and the fact that you had most of the, lower classes that didn't really have any rights, political power. Also, the fact that the Romanovs had been pretty much an absolute regime. They had kind of refused a lot of reforms before. I think they tried some, but really didn't go through with it. And then, of course, the rise of socialism in the country and the fact that Russia did not fare well on the Eastern Front against the Central Powers. And so that had a lot to do with why, of course, later on the revolution, of course, occurred. Russia, by the way, in the war, suffered a lot of casualties. You can see here they had 5 million that were killed and wounded in the war. Another 3 million were actually captured, by the way, by the Central Powers in the war. And that was like half their forces, believe it or not, because the Russians fielded like 16 million troops in the war. Now, what ended up happening, of course, if you know about the Russian Revolution, you can see here, by the way, this is like how far the Central Powers pushed into the Russian Empire by the end of the war. I'll kind of blow it up for you, but by the time of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that was signed in March of 1918, the Central Powers had actually pushed in through Poland into like the Ukraine, driving towards, I guess, St. Petersburg and Moscow. And so what happened back in 1916, prior to this, was that basically Nicholas II took control of the Russian forces in the war. And so he kind of left and went to the front lines. And what he did was he left basically his wife to run the actual state. And she was led by this famous advisor you may have heard of named Grigory Rasputin. And basically, Rasputin was this, he was kind of like this religious mystic and holy man that some people sometimes call him the Mad Monk or something like that. Different nicknames he was called. He wasn't really in the Orthodox Church or anything like that, but he had a lot of influence behind the Romanov family in all of this. And some people think he had some kind of special healing powers because apparently he had healed the Tsarevich, the son of Nicholas II, who suffered from I think it was like hemophilia or something like that. And so that made him like real popular with the family, and he was very close with Empress Alexandra. And so it really helped to kind of cloud things about what was kind of going on behind the actual Romanov family in Petrograd, as they called St. Petersburg back in those days. And so what happened was apparently some pro-monarchists decided that they needed to get rid of Rasputin, if you know about this. So in December of 1916, they had him murdered. They killed him. If you know, I think they tried to poison him at first, but apparently he's such a large man, they had trouble trying to actually kill him. And so the actual murder was kind of botched. And so I think they ended up like beating him to death and shooting him a bunch of times. And they threw him in the Neva River, where I think they later found him, I think with water in his lungs, I think from an autopsy. And apparently they didn't quite kill him. He was still alive when they threw him in the actual river. So yeah, the death of Rasputin was kind of like seen as like the eve of the revolution, like right before it, when it happened and all that. And then the revolution, of course, part of why it broke out was because of Vladimir Lenin, who, if you know about this, returned to Russia in the spring of 1970, like around April of 1917. The Germans allowed him to come back to Russia. He had been in exile for like about 10 years. He had been exiled by the Romanov family, their regime. And Lenin became, of course, if you know about this, the leader of the Bolsheviks. These were a radical far left socialist party that later was known as the actually Russian Communist Party. They called it, or Soviet Communist Party. And Lenin would later help to kind of overthrow, a provisional government that's going to be put in power. And one of the things that happens after the revolution broke out in, like, they think February of what is 1917, and what happened was the Russian Revolution broke out because of the Russian military under Nicholas basically mutinied against him in St. Petersburg, which they called Petrograd during the war. And so he lost power. And so what ended up happening was Nicholas was forced to basically abdicate the throne. I think he tried to give it to his brother, but his brother, the Grand Duke Michael, didn't want it either. And so basically with Nicholas abdicating the throne, that pretty much ended the whole Russian Empire, and the Romanov dynasty, collapsed after that. And so what happened was the Russian Parliament, which was the State Duma, it took over basically, and they created this provisional government, which ran the state from about March to about October of 1917, and eventually it was led by this man named Alexander Kerensky, who was kind of a socialist and lawyer, and he became its chief minister by the, I think, summer of 1917. And the problem with Kerensky was that Kerensky was kind of controversial because of the fact that he wanted to continue the war effort against the Germans. A lot of the people, like the Russians, didn't really want to fight the war anymore. They wanted to kind of quit. And so, but he would remain in control of the government. But because of Lenin, coming to Russia at that point, that ends up, of course, leading to eventually the revolution. Having another revolution, because if you know about the Russian Revolution, it was actually two revolutions. They had the February Revolution, and they had the famous October Revolution, of course, that happens later, and it culminates eventually with the Bolsheviks storming what they call the Winter Palace, which that happens, they think, around November 7th, either 7th or 6th. Kind of debate about when it was, because their calendars were kind of different. The apparently in the Russian Julian calendar, it happened on October 25th is the date, and I think the Gregorian date is like around November 6th or November 7th when they think it happened. And the Winter Palace had been the headquarters of Kerensky's government. And so when it got stormed eventually in November of 1917, the Bolsheviks, slowly took over after that Russia. They took over, St. Petersburg and Moscow after that. And then from there, it caused a civil war throughout the country, which you end up having these different sides that kind of get involved in the war, the so-called Russian Civil War, as they nickname it later. And basically, you get this deal between like around 1918 and 1921 where a power struggle ensues in the country, where the Bolsheviks on one side, the communists are fighting to take over the country. And then you got those that are the non-communists that fight as well to get back the country and, I guess, put the Romanovs back in at that point, because the Romanovs are still alive at this point when the revolution, breaks out. And the two main sides that were kind of involved in it were famously the so-called Red Russians, and you had the White Russians. The Red Russians, of course, were communists, as you know, which the term red was often used for communists because they used a red flag as part of the Red Army. And then the White Russians had, of course, a white army, they often called it. And these were people that were non-communists, or those that were pro-monarchists that wanted to put the Romanovs back in power, basically. And the Red Army itself was developed by Leon Trotsky, who's a famous socialist under Lenin. Anyway, the White Russians were kind of somewhat successful because they got military aid from a lot of the European powers in Europe, like France and Britain, etc. Also, the United States sent troops like into Siberia. Japan was also involved too in the war as well. I know on the eastern side of it in the war, like in Siberia, they had one famous admiral that led the white side, which was Alexander Kolchak, who was actually a Russian admiral, and he was kind of like considered like a puppet to the communist side in the war. He was kind of considered one of the supreme leaders, but he was captured, by the way, in the war and later executed. So I think anybody that was on the white side was either imprisoned or killed after the war if they were captured. And eventually, the white armies were defeated. They lost the war. And of course, the Bolsheviks seized power after that, took control of all the Russia and all that. And then they formed a new state out of it, which I told you before was one of the first socialist states you actually have, which is the Soviet Union, also known as the USSR, or they call it the CCP. Yeah, CCP. Which is the Union of Soviet Social Republics, which will be around for like 70 years overall. And this state, of course, was pretty massive. It went basically from part of Eastern Europe, like where Ukraine and the Belarus area is, you see, and also the Baltic states. You see Georgia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, all the way to Russia, even part of Mongolia at one point they controlled. You can see it all went all the way towards the Pacific Ocean at that. Very bloody conflict, by the way. People don't really talk much about, the Russian Civil War, but somewhere between 1 to 2 million people died, including civilians in the war. So it was a very bloody conflict. Russia's had a lot of bloody conflicts. They've had World War I, Russian Civil War, the Stalinist regime killed a lot of people. And then they've had a lot of people died in World War II as well. It's part of why they're population has always been kind of declining, and I think also why there's more women in Russia than men. If you know about this, because so many men have died and all that over the years. Oh, another thing that's famous about the whole that period of the Civil War and everything. I'll kind of expand this real quick here, but because of the white movement, you get a lot of these pro-independent movements that are kind of around Russia. So Poland kind of breaks away. They formed their own country. That's also because of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Finland would separate and have their own country after that, right above the Baltic states there, of course, around the Baltic Sea. Ukraine briefly broke away for a few years, but the Soviets came in and took it back over, added it back to their states. And so, yeah, then you got the Baltic states. They actually kind of form independently after that for a while, but the Soviets came in later and added that to their states as well. I think right before like World War II breaks out and all that. Now, of course, the other thing, of course, I didn't talk about, which is famous, about the Russian Civil War, is that, as you know, the Tsar and his family were killed. They were eventually executed on July 17th, 1918, Yekaterinburg, of course, in Russia. And the reason why they killed him was because I think there was a deal where the white armies were getting ready to, I think, possibly get him back or something, or because they had been under basically the Bolsheviks imprisoned. So they're kind of concerned that they might get recaptured and be put back into power, basically. And so they executed him, shot them all like in the body or head with like pistols and guns. It wasn't even like a really great execution. It was almost like a mafia style kind of execution where it took some to die like 20 minutes. Horrible. So it was horrible execution. What they did, they even killed all the kids and all that. And of course, there was a rumor that Anastasia, if you know about this, had survived the execution somehow. You know about this. And apparently there were later some imposters that were going around Europe claiming that they were Anastasia. In fact, there was this woman named Anna Anderson, who I believe was, I thought she was Polish or something like that, who claimed to be Anastasia. But after she died, they took some of her DNA. They proved that she was not Romanov. So she was an imposter. So now they made movies about that, like Walt Disney World and things like that, Walt Disney and all that. But it's like bogus. They all got killed. I think they later, after Boris Yeltsin came in the 1990s, they exhumed the body and all that. So anyway, kind of talking about what happened to the Tsar and his family. They were brutally executed, of course, and all that. Now, let me get into next and talk about what happened in the Soviet Union. Lenin would eventually die due to a bunch of strokes that he suffered. In fact, Lenin had a lot of health issues overall. And so over time, what ended up happening was Stalin took over the Soviet Union, who you can see here. And he actually would rule over the Soviet Union for close to about 30 years. I think up to like maybe 1953 when he died. So you have Lenin, who was the first leader of the Soviet Union. He was only like really around for a few years until his death in 1924. And slowly Stalin took over within a few years. It took him like 3 or 4 years to kind of consolidate power. But by 1928, he was kind of like the sole ruler of the state, kind of like a de facto kind of, totalitarian dictator. And his brand of communism was a little different. They call it sometimes Stalinism, which his idea of Stalinism was basically this idea of communism within one nation, kind of rejecting what Leon Trotsky had wanted, which was like permanent revolution, where they were trying to have revolutions all over the world. I think Trotsky believed that the only way that communism would really work long term would be if the whole world was communist, all socialists and things like that. And of course, later, if you know about it, Stalin had Trotsky exiled from the Soviet Union, and he later had him killed, had him assassinated, I think, in 1940. Stalin, of course, as you know, was very famous for his purges, where he began to purge, the Soviet Union of different peoples. It's a period of like political repression that happened in the 1930s, where anybody that was kind of deemed as an enemy of the state, whether it be in the political, like their party, Communist Party, in the Russian military, any kind of peasants or other classes, they had people basically either killed or imprisoned. And it was very famous for like the so-called show trials. You know about the state show trials they had in the 1930s, where a lot of the old Bolsheviks that went back to Lenin's time, a lot of them were accused of being against the regime. And some of them were in prison, some of them were murdered, and all that. And so a lot of the closest people to Lenin, a lot of them were eliminated. If you know about this over time. And Stalin had this secret police, which they originally called the Cheka. Over time, they started calling it the NKVD, if you know about that. They are involved in a lot of these purges. They shot somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, and then the rest of them were either imprisoned or sent to slave labor camps in the Soviet Gulag system. That was very famous throughout throughout the Soviet Union. And the Gulag system was a system of forced labor camps that Lenin had started. Lenin is one who created them originally, but under Stalin, later under Khrushchev, they were kind of used throughout the Soviet Union. They're also used to kind of industrialize the country as well. It kind of used people as cheap labor and so on. And they eventually they were opened eventually in the 1960s. You know about Khrushchev, who kind of eventually ended the Stalin period and all that. But they're not sure how many people were in the Gulag system. It's kind of been debated about that. I think some 15, 20 million people that may have been in it at one point. And here's kind of a map showing you the Gulag system, but pretty much they had all over the Soviet Union, from the western part of Russia. The worst camps were in Siberia, where it's very cold climate and all that. And I think they estimate that maybe 18 million people at one point may have gone through the camps. It's debated about how many people died in the camps. I've got like maybe 2 million, maybe more. They may have died. With Kolyma being one of the worst of the actual camps that was in Siberia, close to the Arctic Circle. And Kolyma was very famous for its gold mines. They basically mined for gold there in the eastern part of Siberia. And the temperatures were harsh. They were like, I don't know what exactly they were, but anywhere from minus 30 to minus 50 degrees, I think, in the wintertime. And so a lot of people died, from, I think, combination of starvation, disease, and also, of course, the winter cold as well. Some claim that, like under Stalin, that 20, 30 million people may have died because of his political repressions and all that. And so it's quite possible that could have happened. It's kind of debated about how many people died. A lot of his policies may have led to that overall. Another thing about Stalin, too, he was also known for his industrialization. They had these programs they started creating called the 5-year plans. These were like these industrial plans to kind of speed up the industrialization and the modernization of the Soviet Union, because he felt like the Soviet Union was behind other nations like in the West and all that. And so one of the things he did, if you know about this, to help to speed up industrialization, they went to collectivizing all of their agriculture, where they forced all the peasants and farmers to basically work for the state. And if you know about this, this created like a mass famines throughout the Soviet Union. There was a case where in the Ukraine, agricultural collectivization led to something like 5 to 10 million Ukrainians dying, like practically starving to death because they didn't have any food, because all the crops went to the state, basically. They couldn't eat it. And so Ukrainians today call it the Holodomor, which was kind of considered like the Ukrainian Holocaust to them. And so that's part of why I think today the Ukrainians, traditional Ukrainians, don't trust the Russians because of that. And I guess what happened later with the Cold War and all that. And then if you were like a middle-class peasant, which in Russia they called them kulaks, a lot of them were actually either killed or sent to basically Siberia or the Gulag. And so he tried to eliminate any kind of middle classes that were in the Soviet Union because, he thought that was like one of the key things with capitalism. So to try to eliminate those social classes. So Stalin really, is seen as this vicious dictator. But if you know what happens later with Joseph Stalin, he's kind of rehabilitated because the fact that, World War II later happens, and you got this worst man named Hitler that comes around. And of course, Stalin helps to defeat Hitler, in World War II. So a lot of people kind of forget about some of those horrors that happened under Stalinism and all that. But Stalin will be in power, like I said, until 1953. He's in power, up to like the early part of the Cold War and all that. So we'll talk about that later because that's going to create a lot of tensions between the West and the East because of the Soviet Union and all that. By the way, I did want to mention about this man named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, kind of few seconds about him, but Solzhenitsyn was this famous Russian writer that was imprisoned in the Gulag system, and he was released. And anyway, he later went on to write several books about the Gulag system. And so because of him, we kind of know about the actual prison systems that were developed in the Soviet Union. He has two famous books. One on the right is a novel called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which actually was a novel that was kind of written about what it was like to live in a gulag for just a day. And then, of course, the other book on the left, I think, which was in 3 volumes, the Gulag Archipelago, that's considered one of the most famous books probably ever written on the Gulag. Definitely something you ought to read if you have time for it. It's very long, but kind of goes into detail a lot about this political repression, of course, under the Stalin regime. So that's something he's kind of famous. He later fled, about this, the Soviet Union, and became a professor, I think, in the United States later. All right, let me talk about the other thing, of course, that happens in World War I that's famous. And of course, that, is the fact that the United States eventually enters World War I, which happens in April of 1917. I'm going to kind of talk about, what are some of the causes of why the United States, of course, entered World War I. The main thing, of course, is that the fact that the United States entered the war because of German aggression in the Atlantic Ocean, because of their, submarine warfare, which was kind of unrestricted. The fact that they were kind of sinking Allied shipping at will, not just warships, but also passenger ships, commercial ships, and so on. Anyway, one of the major issues, if you of course study about the reason why we got in the war, was because of the sinking of the Lusitania. That's one of the major incidents that really, causes the United States to really get involved in the war, or at least to back the Allied side in the war against the Germans. And the sinking of the RMS Lusitania happened on May 7th, 1950. That's the actual date of when it occurred. This was like a luxury type passenger liner, cruise ship that was bound from what is basically New York City, and it was actually going towards England, to Liverpool. And anyway, the Germans had warned Americans not to get on the ship, because it was going to cruise through a war zone. And so the German U-boat, I think it was a U-20, I believe it was, sank it in the Irish Sea on May 7th. And it sank in like 18 minutes, killing about 1,200 people. And it was kind of like a drawing of, or painting of, what it looked like when it went down. And supposedly it flipped on its side. And so very few people were able to get out. And so close to about, like I said, 1,200 people were killed on it. About, I forget exactly the number, but I think it was like 130 Americans were on board, were killed. And so the sinking of Lusitania was definitely considered like one of the major issues that really got the United States later in the war. We almost broke diplomatic relations with the Germans. I think it caused the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, to resign because he thought they should go to war and all that. But they do think it kind of propels a lot of the Americans into really supporting the war. Creates a lot of anti-German sentiment in the country as well because of that. So that's definitely, part of it right there. And the Germans, though, tried to kind of, smooth over differences with us. They came out with this pledge or ultimatum called the Sussex Pledge, where they promised to warn non-combatant ships before they sank them in the Atlantic. And so that was kind of a method to try and hopefully prevent the United States from entering the war. So they thought that might cause a turning point in the war for the Allies to win. So they're kind of concerned about, that, of course, occurring. However, there's this other incident that happened that's very famous that really got the United States involved in the war, which that's the so-called Zimmerman telegram, sometimes called the Zimmerman note, which, of course, emerged around March of 1917 when the British published it in their newspapers. And apparently the foreign secretary to Germany named Arthur Zimmerman had tried to contact the German ambassadors to Mexico because they were hoping to court Mexico into joining the Central Powers against the United States. This was very controversial because of the fact that the United States was kind of in a war with Mexico. If you know about this, we were kind of fighting this kind of a undeclared war with Mexico because of the Mexican Revolution that had broken out down there. And this Mexican bandit you may have heard of named Pancho Villa had invaded New Mexico. And we sent forces down there against him under General Pershing. And so this kind of angered us. And you see in that note there that the Germans were promising Mexico to give them territory back. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, if they gave them like military aid. There's also a case where they even promised to hopefully bring the Japanese in. They wanted the Japanese to also join the Central Powers as well. And so they think that's pretty much considered one of the last straws that really got the United States in the war. And so because of, a combination of unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmerman telegram, the United States decided to declare war on the Germans, which was on April 6, 1917. So that's how basically the United States got in the war at that point. Wilson, here's the actual, Zimmerman telegram, if you want to see it right here with that, but that's the actual telegram that was sent. Of course, some people think it was a phony. The British made it up with the telegram to get us in the war. Some people have speculated that or else, but Woodrow Wilson, who signed the Declaration of War, said that he thought that the world must be made safe for democracy, and that's why we should get in the war. Even though it's funny about Woodrow Wilson, he ran for president in 1916, and he had this promise where he said, "I'm going to keep you out of the war," and all that. He kept us out of the war, something like that. And so I guess he had to renege on that. Let's get in the war. Of course, some people see it as a capitalist type war. A lot of the war industries made a lot of money off of the war, equipment and tanks and airplanes and things like that. That they kind of made. And so that's one thing that does kind of happen, of course, in the war as well. Now, they do have to draft a bunch of Americans to get in the war. If you know about it, Americans had one of the first wartime drafts ever created. What you see here is called the Selective Service Act of 1917. You can see it forced all men between the age of 21 to 30 to register for the draft. You can see 24 million men at one point registered. About 2 million men would end up serving, of course, in World War I. Maybe about 120,000 or so getting killed eventually. It's kind of debated how many it was. 120 to 130,000, I think, is how many people that actually get killed overall. Most of the people drafted in the war, by the way, were predominantly from the lower class, like the working classes were the ones that were drafted. One about those that were college educated like you, very few college educated type students actually fought in the war. I think I looked it up one time. It was 1%. Was all it was. I think I remember one time I looked up my grandfather's draft card. My grandfather, his name was Abe Simon. He was at Ole Miss University, just in like northern Mississippi. It's University of Mississippi, they call it, of course, also as well. And he actually had to register for the draft. And I found his draft card several years ago, but apparently he didn't get drafted in the war. He's kind of a small man. I think he was like 5'3", not a very big man, I think, my grandfather. But it's funny, he was German. I don't think he. I think I know his father had immigrated to the United States in the 19th century from Germany. I don't think he spoke German, but he basically, I think, probably didn't want to fight his own people, that kind of thing. But yeah, they actually raised it like by 1918. Men 18 to 45 also had got drafted, like up to the age of 45, believe it or not. Of course, current selective service today, that men in the United States have to register for, is 18 to 25. That's in case we have a big war that breaks out or something like that. Well, they have that. All right, now also as well, I did want to talk about this famous general here. You see here, John Pershing. If you know about him, he would end up being, of course, the main commander of the American forces on the Western Front between 1917 and 1918. He was a very famous American general, like one of the most highly decorated soldiers, of course, in American history. He helped mentor a lot of American generals later that would fight in World War II, like George C. Marshall, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, George S. Patton, Douglas MacArthur. All these men you've heard of before, kind of influenced them, of course, later. He was known as Black Jack. It's kind of a derogatory name that was given to him because he, in his early career, led black troops in battle, like African American troops. I think about 400,000 African Americans actually was involved in World War I. You know about it. But he was very famous. Pershing was famous for storming San Juan Hill with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders in Cuba. He was involved in the American-Philippine War, where the Americans, took over the Philippines. If you know about that, after the Spanish-American War kind of ended. And he also went down into Mexico and tried to capture Pancho Villa on the punitive Mexican expedition. But Pancho Villa was kind of too slick. He got away, if you know about that and all that. But he's kind of very important. Pershing, was very famous for leading our troops over there. And I think when he got there, he said this famous statement that's well known, where he said something like, "Lafayette, we are here," because the famous Marquis de Lafayette that had aided the United States, in the beginning of the American Revolution. The Americans were there to help out the French, from the Germans. So anyway, kind of talking about, but it's going to take a while for Americans to really get over there and fight. There was actually this other unit I did want to mention that's kind of famous that was involved in the war too. Which you may have heard of Douglas MacArthur. Of course, I mentioned he was only a colonel in the war. Later in War II, he was a famous general that was there. But he got together a bunch of National Guardsmen from 26 U.S. states. They came over early to fight in the war. It was known as the 42nd Division, but later they called it the Rainbow Division because they had this rainbow patch that was on their shoulders. And so MacArthur was famous for leading it in the war. And so a lot of these early, like later generals in World War II, a lot of them get a lot of experience in the war, like Eisenhower and all that. I think Harry S. Truman, who was president of the United States, was in the war as well. And MacArthur was famously called, by the way, they called him Dugout Doug, was his actually nickname. Sometimes nicknamed him. So anyway, kind of talking about how the Americans were kind of training an army at that point and then trying to ship men over to try to fight in the war, of course, against the Germans and all that. Now, also another thing that happened that's very famous, about the war is the so-called 14 points. If you know about this, that Woodrow Wilson is involved in, who's the president of the United States. He issues the so-called 14 points, I think January 8th, 1918, which was actually a speech that he gave in front of the United States Congress, where he outlined some plans for peace to Europe, but also to try and solve a lot of Europe's issues, especially with nationalities and determination of states and things like that, that he wanted to solve differences and prevent war from breaking out later. And Wilson's 14 points were later kind of seen as being very idealistic, but some of these ideas were kind of interesting at the time when they came out. You can kind of see a list of them here. You wanted open diplomacy, the first one there, between different countries, which later on, that idea will later lead to his idea of the League of Nations, if you know about, which he helped create after the war. And he later got a Nobel Peace Prize for it in 1919. The League of Nations was kind of like the prototype or predecessor state to the United Nations that we have today. And so that's something he was really talking about that would be important later. It's the most famous point, which is number 14 in the 14 points, of course. 2, freedom of the seas. 3, freedom of trade. 4, arms reductions, which that was kind of a joke with that one. 5, colonial self-determination, where they would allow, colonial areas of the world to kind of have their own states, things like that. 6 through 8 had to do with German evacuation of like parts of Europe that they occupied. 9 was Italian national unification and all that. 10, Austria-Hungarian, break them up and create countries out of it, like Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia, etc. 11, realignment of the Balkans. That led to Yugoslavia forming after the war. 12, division of the Ottoman Empire and all that, which led to the Republic of Turkey forming and other Middle Eastern states. 13, independent Polish state, Poland, of course. And then 14, of course, was, like I said, the League of Nations, of course, which he came up with. So some very famous Wilson was behind, but a lot of the Europeans, I think the people, average people, thought that these were great ideas. A lot of the politicians of Europe thought he was too idealistic. I think there was even a case where George Clemenceau of France claimed that only Almighty God had 10 commandments, that kind of thing, instead of the 14. But while all that's kind of going on with, Wilson, Wilson's 14 points are going to be important because it will help to shorten the war. Because the Germans think that if they agree to these terms, like in the 14 points, some of these ideas, that might end the war and all that. But at the same time, the other thing that's kind of going on is that the Germans kind of have their own thing because the Russians drop out of the war. That's one thing that happens too in the spring of 1918. The Germans and the Russians agreed to a treaty called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, signed, I think, in Poland. And so with that treaty, the Germans actually got control of Poland. They also got control of like part of the Ukraine, the Baltic states. And I think at one point the Germans occupied Finland as well for a brief time. So the Germans, with that opening, decided to launch their own offensive on the Western Front, their last one, of course, which was called Operation Michael. And it was led by this general named Erich von Ludendorff, who was under Hindenburg, the main general in the war that commanded all the German forces. However, it did form some bulges in the Allied lines, but it only lasted like 2 weeks. And the offensive basically petered out. And so what's going to end up happening later is that the Allies counterattack. The French, the British, and even the Americans get involved. And that leads to the famous 100 Days Offensive, which is one of the last major offensives really of the war that happens. That's one of the things I want to talk about at the end that occurs, the so-called 100 Days Offensive, which lasted from August 8th to November 11th, 1918. So it involved multinational states, which I believe the amount of forces involved in the actual offensive was like somewhere between 6 to 7 million troops were involved. And the Germans just didn't have enough forces to really stop it because you had all these new American forces that were coming in that were kind of fresh troops and all that. And so within like about a month or two, the German defense line, the Hindenburg line, broke. They actually broke through the line and end up driving the Germans back. In fact, the upper part of the Hindenburg line, the Germans get driven back into Belgium by the end of the war, by October, November 1918. The Americans were heavily involved in the war. Kind of showing you a map of the actual 100 Days off. It's called 100 Days because it's about how long it lasted, a little over 3 months. That was the campaign. You can see all the territories that in that's kind of that pinkish area where the Germans had driven the Allies back in March, April, right here. And then, of course, the Allies counterattacked from there, while the Americans were fighting pretty much in the southern sectors here, especially in the so-called Meuse-Argonne, which is actually one of the main battles that the Americans fought in that was very famous in the war. And to us, we call it the Battle of the Argonne or Argonne Forest. That's where most Americans fought in bravely in the war. The Argonne Forest was a famous forest that was in the northern part of France. The Germans had kind of heavily fortified it, and so American troops were sent in there to kind of clear that forest, that and then help drive the Germans back toward the Belgian border at that point. And the Argonne Forest battle, by the way, was the bloodiest battle in American history. I know we think of other battles like Battle of the Bulge or Antietam or something like that, but I think consider that to be the bloodiest battle in American history. 26,000 Americans were killed in the battle. That doesn't include wounded overall. I think the Battle of Normandy, Battle of the Bulge, Antietam, those are considered some of the other bloody battles in American history. Although really, truthfully, Antietam, Civil War, we were kind of fighting each other. So it's not quite the same thing, as fighting an enemy. But they do think that because of the Allies eventually, like I said, drove the Germans back. Their forces were, reeling from this offensive. And at that point, the German government actually collapsed at home. They had this so-called German Revolution I'll talk about that basically takes over the country between 1918 and 1919. And the Kaiser Wilhelm II is forced to abdicate. He actually flees to Holland. And so later, I'll get to later, that the Germans are going to get rid of the monarchy. They'll put in a Republican government is one of the things that's going to happen. Let me briefly talk about some of the heroes that were kind of in the war. I didn't really talk about it in the war, but in the war they had a lot of these World War I aces that fought in the air, like in airplanes. So World War I was one of the first wars where you have air combat kind of going on. And I know on the German side they had the highest ace in the war, which of course was the Red Baron, who was Manfred von Richthofen. And I think he started out as a cavalry soldier in the war and then switched to airplanes. And by the end of the war, before he was shot down and killed in 1918, they say he shot down 80 enemy planes, which was the highest, by the way, in World War I. I think in America, they had Eddie Rickenbacker, I think was another one that was on our side and all that. And so, that really changed warfare, a lot with the airplane, because they could use that for reconnaissance. They could bomb targets. They could take out enemy airplanes, things like that. And so you'll see that later in World War II also being used as well. Also, in the Argonne battle, they had this famous soldier you may have heard about named Alvin York. You see on the right there in that picture. Alvin York was the most decorated American soldier in World War I. He got the Congressional Medal of Honor later in the war. And this man, by the way, single-handedly, if you know about this, in battle, I think in the Argonne Forest, he killed 25 Germans single-handedly, took out 35 machine gun nests, and took 132 Germans as prisoners by himself. And you hear stories like Rambo and all these movies they make later. Sergeant York, was the original Rambo. They make movies out of and all that later. And so, he was one of the most decorated soldiers on our side, pretty much in the war. All right. Now, the Germans, like with the war kind of reeling on their front, eventually decided to end the war. And so if you know about this, in the Compiègne Forest, which is in northern France, the Germans agreed to a ceasefire to end the war, at armistice. And so on November 11th, 1918, they agreed to a ceasefire to end the war at 11 a.m. And so if you know about this, the old joke about the war to end all wars is that it ended on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month. And so people think later, oh, we're not going to have any more wars after that, all that, etc. And of course, today in Europe, they now call it, Armistice Day. They usually celebrate it pretty much still every year. In the United States, we now have, of course, the so-called Veterans Day, which originally honored veterans of World War One. Now, of course, honors all veterans, of like foreign wars and so on, or just any kind of veteran really that's been in the military, etc. And so basically, that's how the war ended. Here, of course, is the famous rail car, if you know about that, where they basically signed the actual armistice on that date on November 11th in the forest of Compiègne. It's kind of famous later if you know about it, because if you know about this, like in World War II, Hitler later got revenge, about that when he defeated the French in 1940, and he forced the French to sign another armistice in that conflict, and he then blew it up. There's basically General Ferdinand Foch. He's like basically the commander-in-chief of the French forces. He was the one that convened the actual armistice on the signing of it. He's the one that's actually in the middle, which is right here. I guess that was a little brochure thing from it for the actual meeting that they had. So anyway, that's basically the end of the war at that point. But it's not really officially over. If you know about what happened at the end of World War One and all of that, they still have to have a peace conference to decide what the results of the war were. And so in 1919, as you know, the Allies met in Paris, France, to finalize all the terms of the war and other treaties that would come, of course, after that with it. And of course, later on, the Treaty of Versailles, which would come out of that, as you know, would end up being signed, of course, in June of 1919. Now, there were a lot of different states involved. I think 32 states at one point were involved in it. There were these so-called Big Four that they always talk about that were involved in the actual proceedings, like the diplomatic proceedings of it. And you can see there the four men were basically David Lloyd George, Vittorio Orlando, George Clemenceau, and Woodrow Wilson. I'll kind of go through them real quick here, but David Lloyd George was the Prime Minister of Britain. George Clemenceau was actually the Prime Minister of France. They often call him the Tiger. It's one of his nicknames. Vittorio Orlando was the Prime Minister of Italy. And then, of course, President of the United States was Woodrow Wilson, which was there. And they all had different ideas about, what they wanted to do at the actual conference. Here's the actual original picture that they took, which is right here. So, yeah, David Lloyd George is right here on the far left. Vittorio Orlando mostly was just there because he wanted to try to get land from Austria-Hungary. The British wanted to help secure their empire and punish the Germans, including war reparations on them. Same thing with pretty much the French and Clemenceau, what he wanted. Wilson was more idealistic about it and all that, about what he wanted to do with the war. A lot of the other powers like France and Britain kind of had their other ideas that they wanted to do more or less, which was to punish the Germans more than anything. So what ended up happening was after the conference ended by about June of 1919, the actual treaty was signed in the Hall of Mirrors, which is interesting, June 28th, about that. It's actually the anniversary date, 5-year anniversary, actually, of the Archduke being shot. Interesting about that. And the treaty actually was very harsh toward the Germans. They really were determined to punish the Germans and prevent the German Empire from, reemerging after the war. And so a lot of historians think now that the Treaty of Versailles and its harshness was a major cause of why World War II happened. Because Hitler, the Nazis would later try to get revenge because of that and all that. And so, yeah, what exactly was in the treaty? There was a lot of different things that kind of went into it, which I did want to kind of talk about, of course, today. And yeah, I've got a list of you that were kind of in the actual treaty that are there. But these are kind of some examples of some things that were really in the treaty. Basically, they took a lot of the Germans' like territory, not just in Europe, but colonies, like in Africa, in the Pacific, were all taken from the Germans, were given to other powers after that. They were forced to have a defensive army. They could only have like about 100,000 troops. They had to destroy all their submarines. They could only have like a few like battleships, I think, after that. The worst thing that happened was they had to pay war reparations to the Allies, which was somewhere around 32 or 33 billion dollars, which it took them years, by the way, for the Germans to actually pay back the actual war reparation. I think they didn't pay it back until 2010. They had to pay it back eventually, which they did, the Germans. So they had that. They also, the French, of course, took back Alsace-Lorraine, it's kind of on the border between Germany and France. That territory switched back and forth a lot between the Germans and French. Hitler would take it back in, about that 1940 as well. They created a demilitarized zone in the Rhineland between Germany and France, which both powers kind of heavily fortified afterwards. The most famous thing that was in the Treaty of Versailles, which some people thought was kind of mean, was that they forced the Germans to agree to what they called the Article 231, so-called war guilt clause. What they said was that the Germans were the blame for World War II, even though really Austria-Hungary had started the war. But I think what they were trying to say was that the Germans were basically the aggressors in the war, and so they were basically seen as being the most to blame for it overall. And then, of course, the thing in the end, as you know, that happened too as well was that basically the League of Nations was another thing that kind of came out of it as well, where that was formed afterwards. So you got the League of Nations was created afterwards, but the only problem with that was that the United States refused to support the actual League of Nations. We were never really a actual member of it in the war. A bunch of other countries didn't want to join either. No, Germany, Japan, others kind of, Italy weren't really in it either. The fascist states later. And so a lot of that was because of the fact that when Wilson came to the conference, in Paris, he didn't bring any Republicans with them. And so Republicans had a majority in the U.S. Senate. They refused to ratify the treaty and all that. And they didn't really want to get involved in the League of Nations because they didn't want the United States to get sucked into all these European issues that were going on. And so that was another thing, too, as well. Then one more thing I did want to mention, too, about the Treaty of Versailles. It created all these new countries in Europe afterwards. Czechoslovakia, was created out of territory that was part of the Austria-Hungary and Germany. Poland, I told you before, was created as a new state afterwards. Yugoslavia was created as a new state. Finland, Austria, and Hungary became separate countries, which they still are today. Baltic states were also recognized as well after the war, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but they were actually taken over by the Soviets later around World War II, of course. They got all these new states, and a lot of them are all weak, if you know about that later. And Hitler's going to take control of a lot of them when the so-called Third Reich is created, or the Nazi regime. Also, they have later a lot of these so-called League of Nations mandates, because you had Arabs and others that came to the conference to try to get help with creating their own states. Because I think Lawrence of Arabia, was actually there trying to help the Arabs get their own independent states and all that, which the Allies didn't really want to listen to them and all that, because a lot of them weren't formed until after World War II. All these different Arab nations that are there now today. But the Ottoman Empire, broke up after the war. So countries like Britain and France went in there, began to kind of occupy them, to govern them after the war. So that's why, like in Lebanon, Syria, those areas, the French were there. British were in like Palestine, or when they call it Israel later, Jordan, Iraq, etc. And in Africa and some of the Pacific territories, even some of the foreign powers occupied those after the war to decide what they were going to do with them, later. Of course, one more thing that was very famous, of course, about the war I didn't want to talk about is all the deaths from the war. You had a lot of cases where a lot of men, died in the war fighting. Also, civilians also died in the war as a whole. The casualty rates for World War I were pretty high. It wasn't, as bloody as World War II, which I think World War II kind of goes up to like 50, 60 million or something like that. But the casualty rates could have been as high as over 30 million at one point, if you include like disease and things like that. Amount of World War I deaths of soldiers, it varies. I see anywhere from 9 to 11 million. It's about how many people were killed. You can see 1 in 8 young men died in France. 62% of all European men fought at some point in the war. Total casualties may have been as high as 30 million. That's a lot of men that were injured, of course, after the war. You can look at the total expenditures in the war, but $180 billion was actually spent on the war by both sides. The United States had somewhere between 120, 130,000 that were killed in the war, but you can see the powers that had the most deaths for Russia, Germany, France, Austria, of course, and Great Britain. So those ones that had most of the deaths. We really weren't much in the war. That was the thing about that. We fight more in World War II than, of course, in World War I. Of course, there's another thing that's very famous, about the end of the war is that they had this famous influenza pandemic that broke out, right when the war is kind of ending, which, by the way, killed millions of people worldwide, which I think there's some estimates it may have been as high as 50 to 100 million. Of course, I got 20 to 40 million in that slide, but some people think it was higher than that it could have killed as many as that amount of people worldwide. They do think it started in 1917, but really took off in 1918. And at one point, almost 700,000 Americans died from the influenza pandemic. And they do think it actually started from American soldiers that were farmers that were on, I think they were farmers that were dealing with swine, like pigs. And so they think that what happened was it was spread by a swine flu in the United States in the Midwest. I don't want to say Kansas, I think is where it was. They went to join other forces that were being drafted. It spread to the other soldiers. They brought it to Europe. And then from Europe, it spread to basically, the rest of the world. And it came in multiple waves, just like COVID. It's come in multiple waves, et cetera. And they call it Spanish flu because oftentimes in Spain, there was a lack of censorship there where everybody knew about it. Because I think when the flu was happening, people were trying to censor kind of what was kind of going on, like what people were dying of, et cetera. And even the King of Spain, I think, had fallen ill from the actual influenza. And so that's why they called it that. But a lot of people just call it the flu, for short, overall. But it was spread by a virus, et cetera. And of course, they made famous books out of it. I think the Great Influenza, a book by John M. Barry, who also wrote that other book, Rising Tide, about the Great Flood of 1927 along the Mississippi River. You can see that they were wearing masks too, just like COVID. They had to cover up. And they even had to close down, like churches, theaters, and schools, and things like that. They did that, throughout the United States as well. But I think one of the big differences between, the one that was then is that they didn't politicize. That was the only thing I didn't like about COVID. It seems like it was politicized a lot, by politicians and things like that overall. But I don't think they did that and all that. But I think overall it almost killed like 1% of the American population because I think I want to say around 1920, the census had the population of the United States at a little over 100 million. So that's about almost correct overall. So anyway, later, of course, next week, I'm going to, of course, be moving on to talk about the rise of fascists. That's the next big thing we'll kind of get into, of course, is to talk about the rise of, like Mussolini, Hitler, fascist Japan. Those kind of things, of course, are going to lead into, of course, World War II. So that's our big topic. Of course, next week we'll do, of course, because we're kind of on the road, in the 20th century to kind of talk about that, because World War II is a major, conflict that really changed the world. Also, of course, causes, the Cold War, of course, later. Looks like I had a few other students that joined me later. Of course, I had Tawana. Looks like she joined me. And Kayla also. Hope y'all having, of course, great morning overall out there. But if y'all have any comments, questions, of course, about the lecture, please let me know. Looks like nobody has anything today, but if you want to leave me comments, questions, of course, about this part 2 lecture, of course, on World War II, World War I, excuse me, please let me know, of course, later. So that's it for the week. I think hope you'll have a good weekend coming up later. Don't forget, you have assignments out there you'll need to kind of work on. The main one, of course, second exam. Try to get that out the way. I think that's due sometime next week. I want to say November 10th is when it's due, which I could extend it possibly if you need it. And next week I will have a quiz coming up on World War I. We also have that video quiz on Devil's Island. That needs to be also, I think, finished as well. So y'all take care and have a great rest of the weekend, of course, coming up. So see y'all later. Y'all take care.